You have moved a stop loss before, and in that exact moment, it did not feel like a mistake. It felt like the smartest decision you'd made all week. That feeling is a lie your brain builds on command, and it's the entire subject of this video. Right now, somewhere, a trader is watching a losing position drift toward their stop loss, and they're doing something that feels, in that exact moment, completely reasonable. They're moving the stop. Just a little. Just enough to give it room. It doesn't feel reckless when they do it. It feels responsible. It feels like judgment, like experience, like exactly the kind of flexible thinking that separates a good trader from a rigid amateur. Almost none of that is true, and today I'm going to show you exactly why your brain manufactures that feeling on command every single time, regardless of whether moving the stop is actually the right call. Most content on this topic treats moving your stop loss as a discipline failure, full stop, like you simply didn't try hard enough to follow the rules. I think that explanation is lazy, and worse, I think it's wrong. Nobody moves a stop loss because they're lazy. They move it because in that specific moment, with that specific information in front of them, it is the single most logical feeling decision available. Understanding why it feels logical is far more useful than being told, again, to just have more discipline. So let's actually look at the machinery producing that feeling, because once you can see it operating, it loses almost all of its power over you. Let's start with two traders, because the contrast here is sharper than in almost any other topic in this space. Owen spent 9 years as a corporate attorney before he started trading, extremely comfortable with argument, with building a case, with marshaling evidence toward a conclusion. When he set his stop losses, he could always articulate exactly why a given stop was placed where it was, below a support level, beyond a certain volatility band, past the low of the last 3 candles. Reasonable stops built on reasonable logic. The problem wasn't how he set them. The problem was what happened the moment price actually approached them. Grace worked for 11 years as a dental hygienist before trading became her full-time work. She'll tell you plainly that she's not particularly gifted at reading charts, and she means it not as false modesty, but as an accurate self-assessment. What she is good at, and what took her nearly 2 years to build, is a specific kind of indifference to her own reasoning the moment a trade is live. Her stop loss is placed by a broker-side order before she ever opens the position, not a price she keeps in her head. An order sitting on the exchange, executing itself, with no input required from her at the moment it matters. Owen has blown through more capital moving stops than he has from any single bad analysis. Grace has taken plenty of losses. Her stop hits often, because that's what stops are for, but she has never once, in 4 years, widened one after the fact. Same market, same instruments, many weeks. The difference isn't skill at prediction. It's what happens to their judgment in the 60 seconds before a stop is triggered. And that's exactly where I want to spend the rest of this video. Here's the first reason moving a stop feels rational. And it's the most basic one. Your brain treats an open loss completely differently from a closed one. This isn't a metaphor. It's a well-documented feature of how humans process risk. A loss that's still open, still moving, still theoretically reversible, registers as a problem you can still solve. A closed loss registers as a fact you have to accept. Your brain will go to enormous lengths to keep a loss in the still solvable category, because accepting a fact feels worse than tolerating an ongoing problem, even when the ongoing problem is statistically likely to get worse. Moving your stop isn't really a market decision at that moment. It's a bid for more time in the problem category instead of the fact category, because facts are final and problems still feel like they have a door out. Owen described this to me almost perfectly without realizing what he was describing. He said that watching a trade approach his stop felt like the last 30 seconds before a verdict, and moving the stop felt like getting the trial extended. That phrase, getting the trial extended, is exactly right, and it explains why the urge shows up as relief rather than fear. You're not avoiding pain in that moment. You're postponing a verdict, and postponing a verdict to your nervous system feels almost identical to winning. The second reason is what I'll call the narrative repair instinct. The moment price approaches your stop, your brain doesn't experience it as neutral data. It experiences it as a threat to the story you told yourself when you entered the trade. The story where you were right, where your analysis held up, where this was a good trade. A stop-loss executing is the market bluntly declaring that story false. Widening the stop is a way of buying time for the story to still come true because your brain is far more invested in being right about the narrative than it is in protecting the account. This is why traders will often say things like, "It just needs a little more room," or "The setup is still valid, the timing's just off," in the exact moment price is proving the opposite. Those phrases aren't analysis. They're narrative repair dressed up in technical language so it sounds like judgment instead of denial. Owen's trading journal from his worst year is full of this exact language. And reading it back now, he says it's almost embarrassing how consistent the pattern was. Every widened stop came with a sentence explaining why the original setup was still technically intact. Every one of those sentences was written in the 60 seconds after price already proved the setup wrong. He wasn't analyzing the market in that moment. He was defending a story about himself. The third reason is subtler, and it has to do with how your brain treats small adjustments versus large ones. Widening a stop by a small amount doesn't feel like a big decision, because it isn't a big number. 10 more points, 0.5% more room, it feels proportionate to the size of the adjustment, not to the size of the consequence. But the consequence isn't determined by how big the adjustment felt in the moment. It's determined by what that adjustment did to your risk-to-reward ratio and, more importantly, what it trains your brain to expect will happen the next time you're in the same situation. A stop that gets widened once becomes a stop that was never really fixed in the first place. It becomes a suggestion. And once a rule becomes a suggestion, your brain stops experiencing it as a rule at all, which means every future stop is being renegotiated in real time, under pressure, by the exact part of your brain least equipped to make that decision well. Grace made this point to me in the most matter-of-fact way possible. She said the reason her stop is a broker order instead of a mental price is that she doesn't trust the version of herself that exists in the 60 seconds before a stop triggers. Not because she thinks she's weak, because she's watched enough of her own behavior to know that specific version of herself, under that specific pressure, is not the same person who calmly set the stop days earlier with a clear head. She's not managing the market in that moment. She's managing herself, and she's decided in advance that the calm version of her gets the final vote, not the version standing 60 seconds from a loss. The fourth reason is what I'll call proof-seeking, and it's maybe the most dangerous of the four because it disguises itself as patience. Once price approaches a stop and you widen it and the trade happens to recover, your brain files that moment away as proof that widening stops works. It doesn't matter that this happened twice and failed 11 other times. Your brain isn't running a fair statistical analysis in the background. It's collecting whatever evidence supports the behavior it already wants to repeat. Because repeating the behavior that occasionally pays off in a dramatic recovery feels a lot better than accepting a small loss on schedule. This is the same mechanism behind every slot machine on a casino floor. The occasional big win doesn't offset the cost of all the small losses required to produce it. It just makes the behavior that produced it feel validated, which guarantees you'll do it again, which is exactly what the house is counting on. Owen can name almost instantly the 3 times widening a stop saved a trade in his trading career. He struggles to name the far larger number of times it turned a small loss into a large one. Not because those trades didn't happen, but because his brain simply didn't file them the same way. The wins from proof-seeking get remembered vividly. The losses get remembered as forgettable, unlucky, situational, anything except evidence against the behavior. There's a fifth force worth naming separately because it doesn't show up every time, but when it does, it's the most convincing of all of them. The exception that feels genuinely different. Every trader who moves stops has at least one story about a time it was clearly, obviously correct. A flash crash that reversed within minutes, an earnings gap that filled the same day. Some specific piece of news that made the original stop level look absurd in hindsight. These stories are real. They happened. And they are exactly why this instinct is so hard to remove completely, because unlike the other 4 forces, this one occasionally has actual supporting evidence behind it. The problem is that this exception gets used to justify the behavior in situations that don't remotely resemble it. A flash crash reversing in minutes is not the same category of event as a trade slowly, steadily grinding against you over 2 hours on ordinary volume. But in the moment, your brain doesn't carefully sort these into different categories. It reaches for the one memorable exception and applies it broadly because the exception is exciting and the ordinary grinding loss is not. Grace's answer to this is almost aggressively simple. She decided years ago that the rare, genuine exception, if it exists at all, isn't worth building a habit around. Because the habit costs far more across 100 ordinary trades than the exception ever saves across the handful of times it might have applied. She would rather miss the one legitimate reprieve than keep the door open for the other 99 imitations of it. Now, here's what actually replaces each of these forces. Because naming a problem without a solution just leaves you more aware of a trap you still can't get out of. The answer to open loss avoidance is removing the decision from the open loss moment entirely. This means your stop has to be an order that executes without your permission, not a price you intend to honor. The instant a stop requires your active participation to trigger, you've built a system that depends on the exact version of you least capable of following it. Grace's rule isn't, I will exit here. It's, the exit already happens here, whether I agree with it in the moment or not. That single structural choice removes the entire mechanism of trial extension, because there's no trial left to extend. The verdict already executed before you had time to negotiate with it. The answer to narrative repair is deciding, in writing, before you ever enter a trade, what would prove the setup wrong. Not vaguely, specifically. If the setup depended on a level holding, then a close below that level is the setup being wrong, full stop, regardless of how compelling the story sounds in the moment it happens. Owen's biggest shift wasn't learning new chart patterns. It was writing one sentence into every trade plan before entry. This trade is invalidated if underscore. When price hits that condition, there's no interpretation left to argue about because the interpretation already happened in advance, back when he wasn't emotionally invested in a specific outcome. The answer to the small adjustment illusion is treating every single stop movement, no matter how small, as a rule violation with a fixed consequence, not a judgment call to be evaluated case by case. Some traders build in an actual mechanical consequence, a mandatory reduction in position size for a set number of trades after any stop is moved, logged the same way a violation would be logged in any other high-stakes profession. The point isn't punishment for its own sake. The point is making the 10-point adjustment feel exactly as significant as it actually is, instead of as small as it looks on the screen. The answer to proof-seeking is keeping a specific, honest tally, over time, of every instance a stop was widened, alongside what happened next, without exception, including the boring failures that are easy to forget. Grace doesn't rely on memory to know whether widening stops sometimes works. She has years of data that removed the question from the realm of feeling and put it into the realm of fact. The data, for her, settled the argument years ago, which is exactly why the argument doesn't happen anymore. There's nothing left to negotiate with a decision that's already been proven in writing across hundreds of instances. And the answer to the exception that feels genuinely different is to write down in advance the actual conditions rare enough to qualify. Not this feels unusual, but something closer to price moved more than a defined amount in under a defined number of minutes, with no corresponding news I can identify. If a live situation doesn't clearly meet that bar, it doesn't get the exception, no matter how convincing it feels in the moment. This sounds almost bureaucratic, and that's exactly the point. Bureaucracy is boring on purpose. It's specifically designed to be applied the same way regardless of how persuasive someone feels in the moment they're asking for an exception. And that's precisely the quality you want governing a decision made under the exact conditions where your judgment is least reliable. Now, here's the deeper thing underneath all four of these. Because if you only take away 4 tactical fixes, you'll still lose this battle the next time the pressure is high enough. Every one of these 4 forces is really the same core event, viewed from different angles. Your brain, in the moment closest to acknowledging a loss, will produce whatever feeling makes acceptance least necessary. It doesn't matter whether that feeling shows up as relief, as a compelling technical story, as a sense of proportion about a small adjustment, or as selective memory about past outcomes. The mechanism is always aimed at the same target. Avoid the moment of closing the loop on a loss, because closing the loop means accepting something painful is now permanent. Once you see all four forces as expressions of that single underlying avoidance, moving a stop stops looking like a market decision at all. It starts looking exactly like what it is, an attempt to avoid feeling something uncomfortable for a few more minutes, dressed up in the language of analysis so it doesn't feel like avoidance while it's happening. This is the identity shift underneath the tactics. The traders who stopped doing this aren't traders who developed a stronger stomach for pain. They're traders who stopped needing the moment of loss to mean anything about them personally. Grace's stop hitting isn't a referendum on her skill. It's an expected, budgeted, occasionally frequent event inside a process she trusts over a large number of repetitions. Because the loss doesn't threaten her identity, there's nothing for her brain to protect by extending the trial, repairing the narrative, minimizing the adjustment, or cherry-picking the evidence. The entire machinery I just described only activates when a loss feels like it's about you. The moment it stops being about you and starts being about the process, the urge to move the stop loses its fuel supply. I want to say something uncomfortable here because it's the honest ending to this argument. If you've been moving your stops, the instinct to do it wasn't a failure of intelligence, and it wasn't a failure of effort. It was your brain doing exactly what brains are built to do, which is protect you from the feeling of an accepted loss, using every tool available, including some genuinely convincing fake logic. That's not a flaw unique to bad traders. It's a feature present in every human nervous system, and the traders who stop falling for it haven't outwilled it. They've outstructured it by removing the decision from the exact moment their nervous system is least trustworthy. There's an uncomfortable corollary to this that's worth sitting with before we close. If moving your stop truly were a rational case-by-case judgment call, you'd expect the decision to move in both directions roughly equally. Sometimes you'd tighten a stop early because new information suggested more risk than you'd planned for, just as often as you'd widen one because new information suggested less. In practice, almost nobody does this. The overwhelming majority of in-the-moment stop adjustments move in exactly one direction. More room, more time, more benefit of the doubt. That asymmetry alone is the tell. A genuinely analytical process would produce adjustments in both directions in roughly equal measure. A process driven by loss avoidance will almost always produce adjustments in only the one direction that delays the pain. If you look back at your own history and every single adjustment you've ever made moved the stop further away rather than closer, that's not evidence of careful case-by-case analysis. That's evidence the analysis was never really happening at all. Owen still catches the urge sometimes, even now, years into rebuilding his process. The difference is that the urge no longer has anywhere to go, because the order already executed before the feeling had time to organize itself into a decision. He describes it as watching a familiar friend show up at the door and simply not answering, because the house rule was decided long before the friend ever knocked. He's not fighting the urge in real time and winning through effort. The urge shows up, notices there's no door left to knock on, and leaves on its own, the same way you stop hearing a familiar noise once you know exactly what's making it. Grace put it more simply when I asked her the same question. She said she doesn't think about her stop loss as a fight she has to win anymore. She thinks about it as a decision she already made a long time ago, about a version of a trade that hasn't even happened yet, and the version of her sitting in front of a live chart today doesn't get to relitigate a decision that a calmer, more honest version of herself already settled. That's not suppression. That's just recognizing which version of yourself deserves the final vote, and making sure the structure enforces that answer, even on the days your feelings would have voted the other way. So the actual question isn't whether you're disciplined enough to resist moving your stop the next time price gets close. Under real pressure in that exact moment, almost nobody is. The question is whether you've built a structure that never lets the question reach you at all, back when you were calm enough to answer it honestly instead of desperately. That's the whole difference between Owen's worst year and Grace's last four.